Well, Community Mental Health Conference. 20 years is a long, long time, and it's really amazing to us that we are continuing to present these conferences. In 2001 and 2002, when Marilyn, my wife, and I were trying to figure out what we wanted to do to, in Naomi's memory, what we wanted to do as a long-term, hopefully way of alleviating other people who were suffering as she had. We really didn't know what we were doing. I mean, I'll be frank. We had made the usual contributions to charity. We had planted a tree. We had got active in mental health organizations. But as far as what we could do in the long term, we had no idea. And we have to take into account what the status was of mental health education in 2001. We were in the dark ages. Let me maybe give you a couple examples. Naomi suffered from bipolar. That was her disease. But it wasn't called bipolar. It was called manic depressive illness. Manic depressive, what did that really mean? I mean, depressive to people was a word that had no meaning. It meant, you know, being upset that the Cubs lost or you got a bad grade. We were told if you wanted to talk about depression, you talked about sadness or happiness, but you never used the word depression because there was no idea what was clinical depression. And as far as manic goes, that was out of slasher movies or out of something. People didn't understand, and there was no concept of what manic depressive was. And when Naomi suicided, again, it was people didn't want to discuss that. It was worse than discussing cancer or something else. Many people had it hidden. I know I felt that way. We were in Europe at the time of Naomi's death, and we're flying back to the U.S., and Marilyn and I talked about it. I said, we have to have a private ceremony, a ceremony that, because nobody knows really what Naomi had been going through. Nobody understood the nature of her illness, and we'll have a small family gathering, and that will be the end of it. And when I came back and we landed in Chicago, and I talked to our rabbi at the time, and he said, if you do that, if you have that private ceremony, no one's going to understand why Naomi took her life. There's no correlation between suicide and mental illness. People will think it was a rational choice. And Naomi sat down and prepared some kind of a balance sheet. Here's what reasons to live, here's reasons not to live, and she rationally picked the reasons not to live. Rationality had no part in her decision. A diseased mind from a mental illness is not a rational mind in any way. So there was a dearth of ignorance about what was mental illness and where was it, how do you talk about it, and mostly education. And what that created was a stigma, the word we use, a stigma, a barrier that prevented people from getting help. We found that there was, I think, about 2 million Americans who were then suffering from bipolar, and 3/4 of those people were getting no help whatsoever. That was the state of affairs. And so when we thought about what we wanted to do, we decided that we needed to perpetuate education. We needed to get people more knowledgeable, lay people, and as well as professionals, get people more knowledgeable about what mental illness was, because the more knowledgeable that the people were, the more likelihood that they would get help, and the more likelihood if they got help, they would have meaningful, successful lives, a future ahead of them instead of the situation they were in. So we read about, we actually got an article about a conference that had been held in California in Marin County, where one synagogue had brought in a speaker to talk about mental health problems. And we said, you know, that's a pretty good idea, but maybe we should have a speaker talk to us too. But instead of having a speaker for one congregation, we ought to do, we have, I guess what my German grandmother called große Augen. We had big eyes. We're going to have a conference. We're really going to have a conference. First of all, it's going to be a community conference. It's not going to be restricted to one group or one religious organization. It's going to be, because mental health affects everybody. It doesn't discriminate on the basis of race or class or religious affiliation. Second, it's going to be a conference in which both professionals and non-professionals are going to attend, because each one can benefit from the other. So let's have both, not just credits for professionals, but lay people who need to have an education and know more about mental illness. It's got to be affordable. And it can't also be just spiritual or just secular. Both spiritual and secular play significant roles in helping to people with mental illness. So we organized a conference, and we decided, how do you organize a conference? Well, Marilyn and I had never organized a conference. There were no conferences similar to this being held anywhere in the United States. And we thought, you got to really do a big conference to get people coming out on a Sunday afternoon in June to come to a conference about mental health. You know, who's going to come to that conference? So our first conference, which was held Sunday, April 7th, 2002, designed called the Overcoming the Stigma of Mental Illness, Understanding Manic Depressive Illness, and Combating Stigma with Facts. Here's what you got for $10 that day. It started at 12:30 in the afternoon. We had a welcome by Rabbi Noble from Beth Emmet. I made some comments. We then had an introduction of the keynote speaker by Dick Kotz from the Mental Health Association, who reviewed all the pending litigation. We had an hour-and-a-half keynote address by Fred Goodwin, who had been the director of the National Institute of Mental Health and co-author with Kay Jamison of the major book on manic depressive. We then had 4 panelists, Fred Miller from Evanston Hospital, Pat Corrigan, and others. Then we had dinner. Then we went into concurrent breakout sessions. Then at 7:30, we had an address by Judith Watts, who was the pastor at First Presbyterian, to give a spiritual message. So somewhere around 8 o'clock that evening, we finally concluded. It was a debacle. I mean, it was. It was horrible. I mean, figuring we thought we would get maybe 50. You know, we had maybe 50 people or so who pre-registered, but there was maybe another 100 people or almost that came to the door that we hadn't counted on. We had to figure out how they were going to get fed, what discussion groups they were going to go into. But the main point was it was successful. I mean, successful not only by attendance, but successful because people came up to us afterwards and said, this was a wonderful experience for me. I never knew other people were suffering like I was. I never knew what bipolar really involved. I have empathy, I have feelings, I now have associations, and I now have a context to think about the whole problems. And we said, you know, that's a good idea. We have to refine it a lot, but we're going to refine it, and we're going to continue to do it. And about the same time that we had put on this conference, the Surgeon General of the United States issued his first report on mental illness. And in that he said, it is the foremost barrier to treatment is the stigma that many in our society attach to mental illness and to people who have a mental illness. Stigma tragically denies people their dignity and interferes with their full participation in society. It must be overcome. That's 2002, the Surgeon General. So all the positive feedback we got, the quote from the attention that was given by the Surgeon General motivated us to continue this for 20 years. So where are we today? Let's compare. Obviously, we've come a long ways in many. There is common talk about mental illness. You pick up the paper. Some of it's not very good, I agree, and some of it's off base. But mental illness is on the forefront of the news today. It's in commercials on television. It's in movies. It's in sitcoms on TV. People are not afraid to talk that they are going to a therapist. It's no longer hidden in the shadows as it was in 2001. Let me give you, just to bring you up to date, here's yesterday's June 11th Chicago Tribune article. Sweeping mental health bill signed into law by Pritzker, a bill that's going to try to encourage more people to get into and remove some barriers for people who becoming mental health professionals and to incentivize employers to try to hire people who are in recovery from mental illness. But this is what Pritzker said at the time he signed the bill on Friday, that's last Friday. I've always said that we need to pull mental health out of the shadows of stigma in order to truly advance holistic health care. Now that echoes almost what the Attorney General had said 20 years before. It's again, I think we've come a long ways in reducing stigma. We still have, don't get me wrong, there's a long way to go. We have groups in our society, large groups in our society, where stigma is still a persistent, difficult barrier to overcome. Veterans, minority groups, Asian Americans, Latinos, African Americans. The group we're talking about today, adolescents, there's many groups in many areas where stigma still prevents a difficult problem of getting treatment. But we made great progress. Veterans, by the way, is another group. I think we are beginning to see the light much clearer at the end of the tunnel. And that's thanks to the efforts of many people who made these. It's not just our conferences, we play a small part, but that's where we are headed. And we couldn't do that. We couldn't have done that without the help of many people, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that. We have our affiliation with the Chicago School, which has provided us with expertise in administration and great help. We have the patrons and the people who've contributed to the financial success, financial wherewithal of our institute, the planning committee that puts together the conference, and most of all, it's you who are attending here, the people who are attending virtually. It's you who have come together, given up your Sundays, come here to learn more about mental illness. That motivates us, and for which Marilyn and I, we're really grateful and appreciative, because that's what we hope to achieve, and thanks to you, we are achieving it. So my appreciation for all that. I just want to add one personal note before I turn this over to our executive director, Tracy. For the last almost 2 decades, our son, Eli, and his family have been living overseas the last 12 years or 14 years in Hong Kong. This week, they're moving into a new house in North Evanston, and they're with us today, so we are thrilled that they can join us. Eli, Rachel, my daughter-in-law, and my grandson, Eitan, who's here. So thank you all again for coming. I hope it's an enjoyable, educational, beneficial morning, I was going to say, for all of you, and our appreciation again. Now I'd like to turn it over to Tracy Levine. She's the one who's responsible for us being here. She's put this all together a year ago or so, when I think Tracy, about a year, became our executive director. I don't think she had any idea what she was getting into. I mean, who knew how you were going to put together a conference with COVID and everything else that was going on? But she's done such a wonderful job of being our executive director, and she's going to tell us a little more about what our institute has been doing and today's program.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Larry. The comments you just made about the first conference, 20 years ago, I think about, this is my first conference, and may it be as big of a debacle as what you just described. First off, does everybody have enough space, right? The elephant in the living room? When we began planning this conference, of course, we had no idea what we were planning for. Would we be doing 100% in person? Would we be doing 100% virtual again like we did last year? Would we be able to do some kind of hybrid? So thank you for being here with us today. We chose the space because we knew that if we actually had to have the social distancing requirements, we would be able to accommodate that. So. Our topic really came together organically in speaking about what we have all experienced over the last few years and the particular impact on our young people. Even the Surgeon General, the current Surgeon General, came out with an advisory on protecting youth mental health. All joking aside, we're glad to be here with you in person as well as virtually. Shout out to our live stream participants. We're proud of the panel we've brought together as well as the range of breakout sessions. We appreciate Dr. Kinzie stepping in at the last minute because Dr. Campbell was unable to join us. We send positive energy and good wishes to the presenters who at the last minute were unable to join us. We're already planning to partner with them so that we can bring their programming and their expertise to all of you in the future. First debacle, we forgot to have people who are applying for CEUs to sign the CEU sign-in at the registration table. So if you are one of those people, profuse apologies. And before we break for lunch, I'll remind you to please do that. First off, we want to thank our panelists and presenters who have all given graciously of their time and expertise to be here with us today. We have the Chicago Schools Marketing and Facilities Department and Advancement Department has been instrumental in helping me and our team to pull this together. My amazing NRCI team, Rebecca and Colleen, I'm not sure where you are, but they have been just working so hard to help bring everything together for us today. The team of volunteers, so the blue shirts that are here assisting all of us today, thank you for being here. And already this morning, how many times you've all said, what can I do? Where can I be? What do you need? Thank you, thank you, thank you. Finally, we wouldn't be here today without our sponsors. Trilogy, who now has a mobile crisis unit serving Evanston and Rogers Park. Yellow Brick, who has consistently supported us year after year here in Evanston and committed 3 presenters to this conference. American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, who also partnered with us to plan and facilitate our teen program for today. Oh, I'm in the right place. Erica's Lighthouse, who also gave input into planning our teen session. No Shame on You, Threshold, Rebecca's Dream, and Rogers Behavioral Health, another consistent supporter and partner with a presenter here today. We wouldn't be here without all of them and their generosity and support of our mission. So this is the original logo for the Naomi Ruth Cohen Institute. And what we've done this year, and you may have noticed, some of the materials bear this logo, and some of the materials bear this logo. We've just undergone a logo refresh, and you are the first to be introduced to that and to our new use of the logo. Talking a little bit about the Institute, from June 2021 through May 2022, we trained over 1,400 individuals, virtually and in person, in various programs, including QPR Suicide Prevention Gatekeeper training, mental health first aid, youth mental health first aid, and starting this week, we will be training our first group of teens, 15 to 18, here in Evanston in teen mental health first aid. We've partnered with the City of Evanston's Park and Recreation Department to train 10 groups of summer camp staff in understanding trauma, bullying, effective communication, and suicide prevention. Of the 219 participants who responded to the post-training survey, 18% of these young people, 16 to 22, indicated ACEs trauma scores of 4 or more. 78% indicated that they or someone they know has been personally impacted by suicide. We continue to partner with Mental Health America Illinois, Mental Health America of the Northern Suburbs, the Mental Health Summit, the Evanston Mental Health Task Force, and the Illinois Suicide Prevention Alliance, among others. As we go into this next year, we are looking at how we can grow strategically from our location at the Chicago Schools Chicago campus to our other campuses in LA, Dallas, New Orleans, and Washington, D.C., to expand our outreach and our impact. With the support of the Cohens, the Chicago School Executive Dean Margie Martin, and our community, we can continue to offer meaningful programs and conferences. Last note, we're trying, we'll see if this works, to introduce technology with this conference. In your folders, you'll see QR codes and a label. The first one for Slido is you can also use your phone and the camera on your phone. I have an iPhone, so if you have an Android, I can't talk you through that one. You can use your camera to scan that QR code on your phone, and it should take you to the slido.com, where you should be able to ask questions electronically Dr. Brooks and myself both have access to that, where we can see the Q&A, and they are anonymous. And Dr. Brooks will be using that later in the Q&A session. And we're going to see if this works and try our first one. It looks like it's live. With which of these do you identify? All that apply. I am a person with lived experience. I am a concerned parent. I am a concerned community member. I am a mental health professional. I care for someone who struggles with mental health challenges. If you can't get the QR to work, you can also go to slido.com and put in that number. And those of you joining us on the live stream can also participate in real time. I'm so excited that it's working. It is, right? Who's going to win? I think we all win. Fantastic. So there'll be a few more of these that'll be launched later by Dr. Brooks. It's still happening, so I'm going to let it go for another second. So obviously, since you can check more than one that applies, we have a lot of people in the room that are mental health professionals, people with lived experience, people that are concerned about our concerned community members, caring for someone who has a mental health challenge, and concerned parents. Thank you all for whatever reason brings you here today for choosing to spend your day with us. Just a few notes. Some of the things we talk about today may be sensitive, difficult, or cause trauma reminders. If you need a quiet space to step out to reflect or would like to speak to a mental health professional, we've designated room E108 as a safe space. It's right to the left of where the registration table was, and we'll have volunteers that can help people guide. If you need to go back, you can just say you need to go to the registration table, or let a volunteer know. And that'll be open all day. Also, just a note that we're in here for a while. This panel's scheduled to go to 12:30. If you need to step out to take a bathroom or other break, please feel free to do so, because we haven't built any breaks into this. So now it is my pleasure to kick off our panel presentation. First, I'd like to introduce James Holtzauer-Chukas, who currently serves in the Archdiocese of Chicago as Senior Director of United Catholic Youth Ministries. James's work with youth focuses on providing opportunities for them to be empowered, to serve, lead, and participate in the present to build a better future. In 10 years working with youth, James has seen significant, overwhelming changes in how we work with youth, but a constant has been the need to focus on mental health. As youth lives have changed to become more scheduled due to the high-pressure world we live in, we need to offer them more opportunities that help their body, mind, and spirit. James.
I don't want to mess anything up here. I'm going to put this down, though. Sorry. Can everybody hear me okay? I know I'm a little shorter. Can I move this? Okay. Okay, hopefully that helps. Good morning, everyone. As mentioned, my name is James Holtzauer-Chukas. I am honored and excited to be here with you all this morning for this really important conference. This is my first conference as well. There are a lot of really wonderful and qualified people here today, and I'm humbled to be here to open with a message about spirituality. I'm an oblate of the Benedictine Order and a Catholic lay ecclesial minister. I've been working with youth in Evanston for many years. I've worked for the McGaw YMCA, District 65, Kids Playing Camp, and for the last 10 years leading youth and young adult ministry efforts through the Archdiocese of Chicago. I'm currently, as Tracy mentioned, the Senior Director of United Catholic Youth Ministries, which is the regional Catholic ministry for youth and young adults here in Evanston. When I was discerning my call to ministry, which at first was a call to the priesthood that didn't last very long, I decided to take up liturgy. I loved organizing masses as a young person, and it really fulfilled my sense of spirituality. But something was always missing. After 2 years of liturgical ministry, our youth minister at the time announced she was resigning, and there was a big question of who would take up working with youth. A couple weeks following the announcement, Sister Christina approached me and said, "James, you should be the youth minister." I'll level with y'all for a moment that I didn't really care for working with youth that much at the time, but for some reason I couldn't quite shake the invitation. As a matter of fact, as I discerned the call, I remembered my own community that embraced me as a young person, even up to that moment, and wondered if this was the call for me to return that grace. It also didn't hurt that when Sister Christina asked you to do something, you typically said yes. Well, long story short, here we are 10 years later, and I honestly can't imagine a more fulfilling vocation than working with our young people. Over the last 10 years, and I'm sure many of you can appreciate this, working with youth and teens feels like a game of whack-a-mole at times. You get one thing down, and another pops up, and another, until at times you are left completely overwhelmed. Through it all, however, I have always had a base approach when working with youth, which is looking at the whole of the human person, which entails three things: body, mind, and spirit. Some also call this soul. We as a society tend to have a lot of resources for working with the body and mind, with a lot of opportunities for working on the body through sports and other physical activities, and mind as our mental health resources improve, both incredibly important things when looking at the human person. But we oftentimes stop and ask ourselves, what about that third thing? What is spirituality? Often people attribute spirituality to being religious, tied to perhaps an institutional religion. For whatever reason, we've made spirituality to strictly be about prayer, meditation, and participation in institutions, but this certainly isn't all there is to being spiritual at all. In the last couple of years, as exponentially more young people are giving up on institutions that support spiritual development because of scandals and other human errors that fail the people they are called to serve, the gap between healthy spirituality and understanding what this part of our human person means continues to widen. But the late Bishop Desmond Tutu said something that resonated with me when I was younger and was wondering about spirituality and where it would take me. He said, "My humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together." I'll say that one more time. "My humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together." This is not only a really important idea for those of us in ministry, but for all people, and a lot of young people really seem to grasp this concept. Young people really care about the world around them. They do a lot of goofy things as well, which seem to get more of our attention at times, but the spirituality of our young people shows in their hearts for serving others, advocating for equality and a better and just society, and the care for our common home. Young people also really pull together spiritually when there is a loss or pain in the community of young people. With the growing amount of self-harm and suicides among our youth and teens, more young people are calling for us to be more aware, especially to those on the margins. Some argue that we are being sensitive and perhaps too sensitive in our world, but what our young people are doing is reminding us of what Bishop Desmond Tutu says, which is reminding us of our humanity, which is bound to the other at all times. Once I asked youth to write a prayer for one of my classes. We were just practicing prayer writing, and a young person turned in a prayer that said this: "Black lives matter. Women's rights are human rights. No human is illegal. Science is real. Kindness is everything," everything in all caps, "and God," underlined, "is at the root of it all." Simple as it was, it made me incredibly happy and moved me greatly to see how this particular young person was integrating their spirituality into the world around them and the things that they cared about. In times of trial, as I mentioned before, youth really do pull together. Sometimes, however, pulling together isn't always enough. We see this a lot, especially, unfortunately, at funerals. As a youth minister, my job is no longer simply about pizza and games, but youth ministers nowadays have to go through a lot more theological education and training, and I've had to learn a lot about bereavement practices and how to answer questions like, where is God or a higher being in this when referring to a suicide or gun violence? Those roads are not easy roads to go down, often heartbreaking, but it does present an opportunity to accompany a young person as they explore their spirituality. Accompaniment, especially in ministry, has become a really important thing, and a really important thing for our young people. We need to be there for them. Going further into what Bishop Desmond Tutu says, as adults, we need to also set a better example. Evanston is a wonderful place to live. I've lived here all my life, but in growing up here, and especially at times as a person of color, I've noticed a solidarity issue that many young people are picking up on and trying to tell us. Putting up a sign or a flag and making statements aren't enough to address systemic change that our young people seem to be after. For example, change in the form of looking at a person who is experiencing homelessness and not just seeing them for their issue, but first as human, and then addressing the needs of that person. Remember, my humanity is bound up in yours. And like I said, our young people seem to really get that. They just sometimes need the guidance to get there. I often call upon religious leaders in my work to embrace and empower young people. I would say the same now to this community, and all of you are here for that very reason, because it's important for us to join with our youth and the organizations that support them. Not to get too religious here, but when the prophet Jeremiah challenges God in the Old Testament, when God calls him to spread the word, he says he's too young. But God responds to him to not be afraid, because God will be with him. I often remind young people that the phrase, "be not afraid," is in the Bible 365 times. A daily reminder for us young people to not be afraid of our age and to go forward with courage. I want to thank you for this opportunity to deliver a short message about spirituality. I look forward to being with you here for a while, and I hope that you will take what you learn here and put it into action. Our youth are our future, and they are present with us now in our communities. As I said, they need us. Let us not be afraid to give them a voice and a seat at the table. I want to finish with an adapted prayer for peace that our youth, actually this was in part written by our youth. It's an adaptation of the Peace Prayer by St. Francis. Some of you might recognize it. Make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine being, grant that I may not seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in our spirituality that we are bound to one another.
Thank you, James. I'm happy to turn it over from here to our moderator, Dr. Keeshawna Brooks. Dr. Brooks helps youth, adults, and the systems they are in with sound school and clinical psychological service, as well as culturally competent and equitable care. As an assistant professor and associate department chair, she gets to teach others to do the same at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Dr. Brooks.
Thank you, Tracy. I want to thank you all for being here today. I want to thank the Cohens, and I want to thank the Chicago School for creating this space for all of us. We're here together as community members, as helpers, as caregivers, as loved ones. And we are really here to center our conversation around adolescent mental health. We've all seen the latest news stories about local violence, global violence, inflation, and living through and living in a pandemic, and seeing inflation, of course, right before our very eyes. But we're also here because we recognize a ray of hope. As I drove in this morning, I noticed the gray, overcast clouds, of course, right? We were talking about this morning. But I also recognize that there's sun. And as a person that's been fortunate enough to experience air travel, like I'm sure many of you have, we get to that layer of clouds and we see the sun, and we know there's hope and a brighter day ahead. And for me, driving in this morning, I recognize this conference as a potential ray of hope, not just for the attendees here, but for the people in the spaces that we create, for the people that are in those spaces that we create when we get home, when we apply the lessons we learned here. And that's my hope for all of us today, to create the same safe space, to talk about mental health, to dismantle the mental health stigma that's been carrying us historically through the present day. So that is my hope for all of us. I also want you to consider your why. So we all show up here as a person in a particular role, whether it's family or professional. But what in your core value brings you here today? My hope is that something that we say as panelists, as moderators, resonates, and that we can bring that core value to the people that we care about. Anyone hear anything that resonates so far? Raise your hand. I hope that is the case. Okay. I'm here to first introduce Dr. Jonathan Singer. He is a professor, a social worker, a podcaster, which we just spoke about. I just followed him today. The name of the podcast is the Social Work Podcast. And he focuses on bridging the gap between technology and social work, and dismantling the stigma of mental health in the process of that. He is also a suicidology expert and the past president of the American Association of Suicidology. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Singer.
All right, thanks everyone. Thank you so much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Hello to everyone who's watching online. I want to say that this is the first live presentation I've given in about 2.5 years, and I realize that my prescription has changed a little bit. So I'm going to be looking at this, and you might see me do a little bit of this. So today I'm going to talk I'm going to provide some statistics around youth suicide. I'm going to talk about some myths and facts, and I'm going to provide some tips that parents, schools, and youth can have to address youth suicide. If there are things that I'm talking about that you already know, give yourself the permission to take a little mental break. If you're hearing something in your role as a professional, and you're also a parent or you're someone with lived experience, give yourself permission to switch back and forth with your identities for how this information fits with you. And before I embark on the stats, I just want to acknowledge where I am, where we are. So I'm talking to you today from the traditional unceded homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations, and many other tribes, such as the Miami, the Ho-Chunk, the Menominee, the Sacs, and the Fox, also call this area home. The region has long been a center for indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. And today, one of the largest urban American Indian communities in the United States resides in Chicago. This is not a performative statement when it comes to youth suicide. Understanding the historical legacy of genocide and oppression of Native people in the United States is important. As you'll see in a slide that's coming up, the highest youth suicide rate is among American Indian and Alaska Native youth. If you look globally, colonized folks, indigenous folks in Australia, New Zealand, Canada also have amongst the highest suicide rates in youth. So this is something that we have to understand because of the context of youth suicide. It's important to understand the social and the historical perspectives. And so if we want a world where people feel like their lives are worth living, we can't have a society that says that some lives are worth more than others. And I'm emphasizing this because so often we think of suicide as an individual issue. But as James mentioned, we are in community, right? We talk about somebody's experiences struggling, and we think about that as an individual thing, but people struggle in context, they struggle in community, they struggle with history. So I'm going to share some stats, and I always like to honor Jerry Reed, who's one of the big mockers in suicide prevention, and he likes to say that behind every statistic is a tear, and this is particularly true when it comes to youth suicide. So if we think about youth suicide, there are lots of different ways that we can break down the stats. One of the ways is over years. And so this conference has been going on for 20 years. What we can see is that in 1999, the youth suicide rate for youth ages 10 to 24 was about 7 per 100,000. That means for 100,000 youth ages 10 to 24, 7 died by suicide. And what you can see is that the numbers went up and they went down, and then starting in about 2007, there was a pretty steady increase all the way up until 2017. 2018, 2019, it was about the same, and then 2020, the stats went up again. You might be wondering, well, we're here in 2022, June of 2022. Jonathan, where are your stats for 2021? One of the issues is that we don't have real-time data for youth suicide, for suicide in the United States. So yes, I know that we can all look and find out how many people tested positive for COVID in some small city in Louisiana yesterday, but it takes about 1.5 years for us to understand how many people died by suicide in the United States. And this is a larger structural issue that makes it difficult for us to respond in real time to the intersection between what's happening and what's happening societally and what's going on with particularly our youth and suicide risk. Now, you can look at this and wonder, well, so what happened in 2007? There are lots of hypotheses, but we don't know for sure. One hypothesis is that it's the rise of social media. So you have iPhones, you have Facebook, you have a bunch of these social networking sites that came on board around then. But we also have the Great Recession, which at this point might sound not so great after what we've just lived through, but if we think back, it was pretty devastating. And so what we have is we have a confluence of several factors that might contribute to youth suicide, the increase in youth suicide death. Another way to think about it is if we think about race and ethnicity. And one of the pervasive myths is that suicide is a white people problem, when in fact suicide kills people of all races and ethnicities. So if we look at the 2020 data for youth 10 to 24, what we can see is that the suicide rate is about 7.4 for Asian American youth. Youth who identify as multiracial, it's about 7.7. Black or African American, 9.6. White, 10.9. Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, 14.3. And 19.2 per 100,000 for American Indian or Alaska Native. Another way to think about suicide is what are the issues that were happening when somebody died? And these stats are from the NVDRS, the National Violent Death Reporting Statistics. These data are from information that's gathered by a bunch of different people about each person that dies. And so they gather this information. So what we know, and this is 2017, there's 2018 data that's very similar. I've changed the age range, so we're talking about 10 to 19 here. We can see in about 1/3 of suicide deaths, there was a crisis that happened in the previous 2 weeks or the upcoming 2 weeks. Now, what does that mean? That means that there was some anticipated crisis, such as a court date or not being able to graduate or something like that. There was some anticipated issue. If we look at family relationships, intimate partner problems, arguments or conflicts or school problems, we can see that about 20 to 25%. So about 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 youth had these problems that were going on at the time that they died by suicide. Now, if we look at some of these other issues, other relational problems, criminal legal problems, past suicide, childhood abuse or neglect, job problems, we can see that there far fewer percentage had those going on. And the reason why I'm highlighting this is because all of us in the room have skills, training, and access to the things that were present in 1 to 4 and 1 to 5 suicide deaths, which is school problems, arguments, intimate partner problems, and family relationship problems. These are things we have some control over. These are things that we have training in how to address. And I think that is hopeful, as Dr. Brooks was talking about. Another way to think about suicide deaths is by looking at the year. What is the trend of youth suicide deaths in a given year? Again, we're looking at youth ages 10 to 19. And this is the calendar year, but it's looking at a 20-year trend, right? It's looking at 1999 to 2019. And what we can see is that in January, we have a peak, it dips in February, and then we see this, one hump. And then it goes down in June and July. It goes back up again. It peaks in October, and it goes back down again in December. The lowest number of suicide deaths, let me be clear. These numbers are actual suicide deaths. So in June, over this time period, there were 3,282 youth ages 10 to 19 who died by suicide. So that's how you read the numbers. So what we see is that the vacation months, June and July and December, are the months where there are the fewest suicide deaths amongst youth. When we look at the highest number of suicide deaths, we see that it's January, which is the month right after the lowest suicide death, and then April and October. So all of us that work with schools and anybody who's been in school, we can see there's a pattern here, right? And I'm a big proponent for suicide prevention in schools. I think it is an essential location. I think there's enormous value in it. And I think it's important for us to look at these and say, wait a minute, there is a correlation here between the time that kids are in schools and the time that there is the most number of suicide deaths. So we have to think about what's going on. Well, the pandemic provided us with a unique natural experiment. And I want you to look at the dotted line there. Those are the months in that first hump of this trend that correlate with the beginning of the pandemic. So if we look at 2020 data, there's the trend for the 20 years. And these are the actual suicide deaths for youth in 2020. And so what we can see is that January starts out high again, goes down to February, right? That's the trend. But starting in March, it didn't go back up. And then what we see is that when everybody went fully remote, this number of suicide deaths continued to decrease. And in fact, they decreased to the point where they were lower than they were in the summer months, something that had never happened before in those previous 20 years. And then when folks went back hybrid or in person, we saw the number of suicide deaths go back up again. So why? Why would this be the case? Well, again, hypotheses, not conclusions. One of the hypotheses is that when everybody went remote, schools were scrambling. Like, how do we do this? There were lots of schools that said, you know what? For reasons of equity, for reasons of trying to keep everybody's sanity, we're going to go easy on grades, right? We're essentially going to go pass-fail. Concerns about what your peers were doing on the weekends went away because everybody was at home with their parents, right? I don't have to worry where Johnny's going with his friends because Johnny is exactly where he's been all week, which is in his room. There's also some data to suggest that bullying and cyberbullying reduced at the beginning of the pandemic and then actually continued, in part because when people went back, there was more monitoring, there was less informal time where bullying and cyberbullying could occur. There was also more time for sleep. Data showed that teenagers were getting, on average, about 45 minutes a day more sleep in the beginning of the pandemic than they were prior to that. And sleep is an important factor in youth suicide risk. So again, we don't know, but what we think is that there were a lot of things that coincided that reduced suicide risk amongst youth. Here's some stats about bullying over time. And what we can see is that between 2016 and 2019, victimization and offending increased. And then in 2021, this is the trend, it reduced. And this was true for 2020 also. I'm going to very quickly go through these numbers. This is another way to think about youth suicide. So again, these are high school students, and this is not death, but these are thoughts of suicide and suicide attempts. And this is from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. So what we can see, I do have to take my glasses off for this one. We have about 19% of all high school students saying that they had thoughts of suicide in the past year, and about 9% reporting a suicide attempt. When we look at female and male, which I understand is a problematic binary, but that's how the data are being collected, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey actually has questions on for do you identify as transgender, but most states are not deploying those questions, so we don't have very good data on that. But for youth that identify in the binary, about a quarter of females report having thoughts of suicide, about 11% attempts, about 13% of males report thoughts of suicide, and about 6.5% report attempts. Now, if we look at by grade, what we can see is that thoughts of suicide increase with age, suicide attempts decrease. One thing that I think is important to know is that suicide deaths are increasing over this time. So the number of kids that die by suicide increases between 9th and 12th grade. If we look at race and ethnicity, we can see that about 17% of black youth report thoughts of suicide, and about 12% report an attempt. Hispanic, it's about 17% with ideation, 9% with attempt. And with white youth, it's about 19% with ideation and about 8% with attempt. The important piece for this, for me, is that there is a much smaller ratio for black youth between those who are identifying thoughts of suicide and those who are attempting. And there's lots of questions that this raises. Are there issues with how we are assessing for suicide risk amongst black youth? Is there concern about discussing thoughts of suicide? Oftentimes when black youth disclose that they are upset, that they are struggling, it is coded as threatening or problematic, and they are more likely to be pipelined into something punitive rather than helpful. And so is there an issue systematically or structurally with how we are addressing suicide risk amongst black youth that is reflected in these? We don't know. And then the last way I want to talk about suicide risk is by looking at sexual orientation. Again, there's stats on gender identity, particularly from the Trevor Project, which follow a similar pattern in that heterosexual youth have the lowest ideation and attempt. If we look at gay or lesbian youth, high school students, we see about 40% report thoughts of suicide and about 20% report an attempt. For bisexual youth, it's almost 1 in 2 report thoughts and suicide, and 1 in 4 report an attempt in the past year. And those who are unsure, it's about 1/3 reporting an attempt or thoughts and about 1/6 reporting an attempt. So these do not even address intersectionality, right? So what are the rates of a bisexual Asian American 10th grader? I don't have these stats, and I'm not going to go into them, but they are there. And for me, one of the important things about this, particularly for schools, is how are we thinking about where are we deploying our resources and at what point, right? These are national stats. The stats might be different here at ETHS or in Illinois or wherever you're watching from. But this is one of the important things about these numbers. One of the myths about suicide is that people who are suicidal are weak. And what's true is that people can be suicidal despite enormous strength and courage. And I think this is a really powerful message to share with youth and parents, and it's a good reminder for professionals. And I found this image online, which I think actually does a much better job of explaining it. It says, "Do not confuse my bad days as a sign of weakness. Those are actually the days I'm fighting my hardest." Another myth is that if I ask somebody about suicide, I'll put the idea into their head. And what's true is that asking somebody about suicide will not make them suicidal. And we know this from anecdotal feedback as well as empirical research. We know that when you ask folks about suicide, it actually reduces their distress. And research by Maddie Gould out of New York found that when you ask suicidal kids about recent suicidal thoughts or behaviors, it actually decreased their distress. And asking those same questions to kids who were not recently suicidal not only did not increase their distress, it did not increase the number of youth who then later reported being suicidal recently, right? So it's a good thing. And so anybody who's talking with a kid and the kid's like, oh yeah, I don't think anybody would care if I lived or I died, that's the point where you say, okay, are you having thoughts of suicide, right? So you ask the question. You will probably be worried, am I going to put this idea into their head? And when you have that thought come into your head, then you can say, okay, thanks for sharing. I'm now going to go ahead and ask the question because I know it's not going to put the idea into their head. This is the cover of our book, and we had one of the desks colored orange as opposed to yellow to highlight the fact that there's going to be some kid in a classroom or in any setting that is having thoughts of suicide. And we don't know unless we ask. And so this is one of my arguments for universal screening. I have to add a couple of slides here about technology. And I really like Dana Boyd's take on this. She's an anthropologist. And one of the things that she said was that most teenagers aren't addicted to technology. If anything, they're addicted to each other. And I know that this is certainly true when we have kids who are on their phones all the time. And I can think about myself. When I was a teenager, I didn't have a cell phone, but I did have a really long phone cord that I would pull into the stairwell, and I would just talk for hours with people that I had just been in school with. And so the technology's changed, but our desire to connect with our peers has not. Another thing that I think is really important to remember about kids is that on social media, interactions are public by default and private through effort. And one of the things that this does is it encourages youth to hide the things that they're saying because they're looking for ways to be private. And so what this means is that we have to understand how kids are communicating distress online. For example, if you see a picture of Kermit the Frog, you might be like, oh, that's so fun. This 15-year-old is posting a picture of Kermit the Frog. Well, the phrase Kermit sewer slide is a phrase that youth use to indicate suicide, commit suicide, right? But the picture of Kermit has come to represent that. And so these are just things that are important to know about as we're monitoring what's going on online for kids. How much time do I have? Or am I done? Okay. All right, so let me just share some tips for parents. I think one of the most important things for all parents to do is to make sure that their teens are sleeping. However you can do this. And if that means addressing the cell phone, right, making sure that it gets shut off at 9 p.m., that it's not plugged into their room, you know, sleep hygiene, whatever you need to do, it's really important. We saw it correlated with decreased suicide deaths during the early part of the pandemic. We know that it's an issue. Another thing is talk with your teen. And as a parent of a teen, I know this can be challenging, especially because my teen tends to want to talk to me late at night when I'm ready to go to bed and I have no energy to talk to them, or I'm doing something and then they're ready to talk. And so the reminder is that teens want to talk, just not on your time frame. It's important to model mental health treatment. If you see that your kid is struggling, you're like, you really need to see a therapist. And they're like, really? Because you are so screwed up, I've never seen you go to a therapist. It's going to be much more difficult to convince them. And I'm not saying everybody in here needs to go to therapy. I find it useful. But it's important to be able to model mental health treatment, however that looks. It's important to want the best for your child, not for your child to be the best. And this is a message that can get internalized really quickly in our kids. And so sometimes we see kids who struggle with suicide who have a lot of internalized pressure. They're telling themselves, I'm not doing enough. I'm not doing well enough. Maybe they're in a peer group, right? Maybe some of it's coming from their parents, right? Unintentionally or intentionally. Like, I really need to keep on my kid to make sure they do the best, right? But the tip for suicide prevention is want the best for your kid. Another tip is it is you and your teachers for your teen, not you and your teen against the teachers. So if we're asking schools to monitor kids, to let us know when they see something that's wrong, that's troubling, that's concerning, and then teachers are coming to us and say, hey, I have a concern, that's when you say, okay, let's partner for my kid, rather than being like, wait, why are you not on my kid's side, right? And it's you and your teen against the teacher. That doesn't work out for anybody. Number 6, get a pet, which most people did during the pandemic, so good job. And number 7 is keep calm. If your kid is in crisis and then you go into crisis, it's not going to be helpful. Like at a neurobiological level, it's not helpful, but also just in a basic interaction level, it's not going to be helpful. 6 tips for schools. Number 1, conduct universal screening. Know which one of your kids are at higher risk for suicide. Suicide risk varies within school districts, within buildings. Number 2, collaborate with parents and communities. Number 3, aspire to 0 suicides. Now, this aspirational goal means that when any staff member walks into a school building, their attitude should be, I'm going to do everything I can, every single thing possible, up until the very last second to keep this kid alive. And if a kid's not actively suicidal, I'm going to do everything that I can to ensure they know this is a world that wants them to be living in. Number 4, train staff to recognize and respond to suicide risk. Everybody, not just the mental health professionals, the bus drivers, the coaches, the lunch staff, all those, everybody. Recognize mistakes as learning opportunities. We all screw up, right? When our kids screw up, what do we want them to do? We want them to let us know, right? We see it as learning opportunities. If we're in a work environment where our mistakes are seen as huge problems, then we're more likely to say, I'm not going to let my boss know that I screwed this up. And that is no good, particularly when it comes to suicide risk. And then finally, care for staff. We know that organizationally you can reduce burnout by making sure that when there's a suicidal crisis and people have been working on it, those who are most directly involved are told by administration, we're going to take something off your plate. In fact, you let us know what you want us to take off your plate. Now, my experience with school psychologists, social workers, and counselors is oftentimes they're like, there's nothing you can take off my plate. I have so much that I need to be doing right now. And that's where it takes good, strong leadership from administration to be like, no, really, we're going to take something. You have to pick one of these 5 things, and we're going to take it off your plate for the next week. And then finally, for kids, don't worry about upsetting adults. When you are upset, you can be upset. It is our job to manage our responses to you. Number 2, your reasons for living might not be in your life yet. I have a good friend named Desiree Stage who was suicidal on and off her whole life. And today, her reasons for living are her kids and her wife and her career. She just didn't realize they were going to be in her life yet, right? But she stuck around and she's glad, and I'm glad that she stayed. Don't confuse being sad, angry, scared, or lonely with wanting to die, right? Mental health is having the right emotional response at the right time and having the tools to manage that. Mental health is not feeling good all the time. And so if you're sad or lonely or scared, that's just part of life. It's not the same as wanting to die. If, of course, you want to die, please let us know so that we can address that. Don't discount your experiences. Some are windows, some are mirrors, right? Some of the things that you're going to experience will help you see a world that you didn't know exists. And then some of them are going to help reflect on who you are. And some kids love looking in the mirror, and some don't. And then finally, it isn't about you. So all the things that are going on in the hallways, all the things that are going on with your family, the fact that your parents are late to pick you up, that they don't want you to do this, they don't want you, that's as much about them as it is about anything else, right? So you don't have to adopt that as your own. But the other thing is that everything is about you. So all the feelings that you have, those are totally legitimate, and you should be able to have those, right? The fact that you are on this planet means that you deserve to have somebody who will listen to you and validate you. And so everything is about you at the same time as it's not about you. So I'm just going to end by saying that one life lost to suicide is one too many. And I hope that everything that you learn here today will help to get us to the day where we see these numbers decrease fairly rapidly. These are some resources. Starting in July, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is going to convert to 988, which I have a lot to say about. We can talk about some other time. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Singer. On a personal and professional note, your book was an integral part of my own training as a school psychologist. And I was fortunate enough to train in a school that did universal screening. And I was able to encounter my own thoughts about not saying the word suicide and have come to the place now where I can assess and intervene. So I thank you for that. Yes. All right, we're going to hear from Dr. Taya Kinzie, who's going to talk about what schools are doing in the effort to prevent, intervene, and support adolescent mental health. Dr. Kinzie.
So, hello everyone. It is really wonderful to be here with you as we are all owning this together and our efforts, both having attended this conference, having supported the creation of some of the programming in the past and today is really powerful. I also want to say thank you to Dr. Brooks and as well as actually to Dr. Singer. I'm going to be walking you through this a little bit today, but actually thank you for the partnership that you have offered ETHS, both in consultation as well as our implementation of suicide prevention and life solutions, so thank you. I'm going to walk you through a little bit today about some of ETHS's own journey. I actually started at ETHS 18 years ago as a social worker and licensed clinical social worker and have worn different hats along the way at ETHS, and I'm really proud of the journey that we have been on to think about how are we integrating well-being and how are we understanding that it's not separate from academics, that mental health can be incorporated and is actually inextricably intertwined with everything that we do in the school environment and out in the community and with our families as well. So we're going to walk you through a little bit about that, specifically looking at our year of 2020 and 2021 as we reflected on that and have had more opportunity, not unlike the information and statistics that we were referencing with regard to suicide prevention and suicide statistics, but thinking about what have we done and what actions have we taken and what else are we looking forward to doing. So we're going to walk you through that from a school-wide prevention perspective, from intervention, and really thinking about how we're coming together to do that. So wanted to start by recognizing that we want to share about the things that we're doing well and also the things that we want to continue to improve upon. There's so many facets that go into student well-being and impact mental health, and one of them is regarding respect. So it's tremendous that when we look at our data, 96% of students feel treated with respect by their teachers. But let me pause there for a moment, because that means 4% aren't there yet. So we want to, and we are continuing to identify how can we increase that sense of belonging through that sense of respect. Similarly, students, 89% report feeling treated with respect by their peers. Again, we want to look at we're celebrating that 89%. And then we're looking at how can we continue to build that 11% sense of well-being and respect. So I think it's particularly important because research shows the importance of social emotional learning. And in the school environment, when we talk about mental health and when we talk about well-being, social emotional learning is actually one of our state standards for learning. And it's intertwined with everything that we do. And when we use respect, it actually harnesses students' desire for status, for respect itself, for peer influence, and it provides a purpose for learning. And so we really want to focus on that defining respect isn't just simply as, am I nice to you, but really thinking about a genuine sense of listening to what each person has to say, because that marks the basis for meaningful social interactions. And you'll hear throughout our presentation, it's one of the reasons that we continue to lift student voice throughout everything that we do. Too many papers here, sorry. As we look at our attendance, one of the things that we saw in the pandemic, particularly as you can see in the school year 2020 and 2021, is that our average daily attendance rate, even though we were remote for almost all of that school year, for one quarter we were in a hybrid setting, was that we all did the pivot, but we thought about what are our roles and how are they going to be different to engage students for attendance, whether that's remotely or whether that's in person in the hybrid environment. And students reported still feeling, 91% of our students felt like, okay, I strongly agree. My teachers actually are working hard to make sure that I stay in school. And we want to continue those efforts. One of the ways that we did that was by teaming with a variety of folks, from teachers to staff who we redeployed to leaders and administrators. We completed 205 home visits during the pandemic, during that year, when we identified students who were very disengaged and were having a really hard time re-engaging even by attending class. We actually made 18,628 phone calls for intervention to say we care about you. Even when we did the home visits, we didn't just go and say, hey, what's happening? We brought Wildkit care kits. Wildkit, actually, well-being kits was one of the things we did, and those were sent throughout the year, but also during home visits with T-shirts, with swag bags to say, you're part of us. We want you at ETHS. And then even at the beginning of the school year with 1,000 phone calls before school started, because it's so easy at times to check out, and we want people to check back in. What we see when we think about attendance is that it makes a difference, not just in this moment, but it makes a difference long term. Every step that we're taking to communicate the importance of each student's participation. And so one of the things that we look at is, obviously, we're looking at our 4-year graduation rate, our 5-year graduation rate, because for us it hasn't been enough to simply say, oh, look at our graduation rate. We actually often reach back out. When a student stops attending, we do multiple steps of prevention, but then we reach back out to say, can you come back? We are here to support you. And so we stopped looking at truancy as a bad number and used it to speak to us and what steps we were going to take to help students re-engage, whether that's through re-engaging right into their classes or looking at different settings, specifically thinking about the voices of our parents and our students. We do get feedback from students throughout, and here's some of the feedback in our alternative school that we have within ETHS. It was a positive impact. My teacher helped me understand the subjects I was having issues with and solving problems together. The positive atmosphere of alt school really helped me to continue and to push to finish. I had teachers that motivated me to work, and it made it easier to work because classes were small and each teacher respected me. So you can see that we're looking at this from that global school-wide perspective, all these facets of well-being, and we think about student needs, connecting to resources. One of the ways that we're doing that is by building that relevance to the here and now and to the future. And that's through our ICAPs as well. That's our individual career and academic plans, and looking at the many ways that we define success for the future. And one of the things that ETHS has worked really hard at is defining those multiple pathways to success. And that includes technical programming, that includes going directly into the world of work or internships or college or all of the above. And so we're excited about the ways that we're doing that and community partnerships for that as well. And we were actually talking before the event about the many things that we have online that we didn't pre-pandemic. So we're using those as tools, and we keep them on our website. Dr. Singer is still on our website from our presentation this fall, so that parents and families continue to use these tools all the time, whether that's recorded events, our career options and pathways. So we're going to continue those efforts. Our extracurricular activities, and all of these are ways that we're walking through, are benchmarks of how our school goal, because one of our primary school goals focuses on well-being, and we weave equity throughout everything that we do. And one of the things that we look at, as you can see here, is extracurricular activities. Even in the pandemic, we had 58% of students participating in at least one extracurricular activity. And you can see how that varies from school year to school year, including pre-pandemic, even higher rates. But we're also looking at how do we define that sense of well-being through formal activities, and how do we delineate by race as well. And you can see we are continuing to try to build that sense of belonging in our school culture. One of the things that we engage in is a well-being survey every year, and we look at a variety of well-being components, and some of it very specifically is mental health. So you can see here that in our 2021, which was March of 2021, which brings you probably to think about statistically what's happening for adolescents at that time, 33% of students in 2021 reported that stress impacted daily activities for 11 or more days. That's pretty intense in the previous month. 30% reported feeling sad or hopeless most days for 2 weeks that resulted in stopping doing some usual activities. The good news for us is that our students do a tremendous job, as do our families and our staff, of connecting students with resources. Our mental health support in the school as well as in the community. And we have some statistics here showing that while 44% of our white female students were seeking out resources, we also know that in terms of supporting our LGBTQ+ students, there's been tremendous use of resources, and students who identify as 2 or more races. And this is very important to us because one of the things, again, as we look at, and we're going to talk about in a subsequent slide, how does our support mirror the needs and mirror our demographic and student identities? So we're going to continue to look at that here for you. But first we want to walk through, again, looking at need. You can see from 2013 to 2020, going from 92 social work referrals, and social work in the school setting is one of the primary mental health providers, to 477 school social work referrals. Now that comes from students, but largely from staff. We also focus a lot on our prevention from a school-wide perspective, our intervention, our alternative to suspension, and also thinking about all of the mental health groups, over 50 mental health groups, creating 2 additional social work positions for the school year 2021, and also the fact that we partner with so many organizations, including our school-based health center right here in our building. But we're most pleased to say that when we think about identifying gaps and identifying needs, our services reflect our student enrollment by race as we continue to center equity. As we continue to look at needs, one of the things that ETHS is no different than other schools for is the needs have increased. Diagnoses have increased. You can see 167% increase in 7 years. To 577 individual 504 plans. So that means there is not a demonstrated need for special education classes, but there's a diagnosis that is getting in the way of major life functioning, and it's our job to figure out how can we create accommodations to support the students' learning. Even during the pandemic, we had almost 2,000 visits to our health services. Our psychiatric hospitalizations were significant, and what we saw was repeat hospitalizations. While we had 106 students, unique students, and that's our language for individual students who were not repeated, that was a decrease from the previous year. However, what we saw was an increase of individual students being repeatedly hospitalized, and that has spoken to us about what additional supports are we putting into place. And then, as you can see, there's so many facets to our COVID journey, making sure that everyone's physical health and mental health, again, which are intertwined, that we're addressing fully. As we think about connecting to more resources, as I mentioned, there's a variety of ways that we're doing that, and the response to the additional 504 needs is ETHS has really continued to be attuned to what are the needs of students and how are we meeting their needs by creating 2 new 504 case manager positions and continuing to team with students with IEPs for case managers, and then also our implementation of signs of suicide with our 32 mental health providers that are ETHS staff members. We are so fortunate to have that number at ETHS and to team together and to utilize signs of suicide as a universal screening as well to identify potential risk. Because one of the things that we saw, even this year, in school year 2022, we saw significant increases in our first quarter, 104% increase compared to fall 2020. It was our first time of being full in person. And not unlike what Dr. Singer spoke to, we really had to pay attention. How are we supporting our staff who are identifying and really supporting all of these students who we have noted as at risk? And how are we supporting, that's the mental health providers, our teachers, our secretaries, all of our staff who play a role in this. So we are continuing to look at how are we going to heal and continue to help our staff moving forward. Even as we saw a decrease, once there was more acclimation to being in person, we saw a decrease in terms of risk assessments, suicide risk assessments and needs. Second quarter being at 39%, and then third quarter actually seeing a decrease in comparison to third quarter 2020. What we know is student need is still great, and in order for us to adequately serve students, we have to support our staff. Staff are important, as are our students, which is why they bring you just to pause for a moment. Dr. Brooks, you asked about, each of us ask ourselves, what is our why? And what is our why for being here? And our students absolutely help us stay centered on our why. One of the new elements that we had integrated from a school-wide perspective, thinking about prevention, is how are we truly embedding social-emotional learning instead of just curriculum, but how are we embedding it everywhere? And so there's been a lot of efforts around that. Teachers actually, and were supported in creating a teacher-to-teacher SEL toolkit. That is that organic opportunity to think through, well, how does this apply to chemistry when I'm thinking about mental health and social emotional learning? How does this apply to math? How does this apply to English? What does that look like? And so there's been tremendous efforts with staff who have driven that initiative, as well as through the curriculum. So this is an example of an emotional identification and regulation curriculum and screenings that we've been engaging in. Dr. Rosick, associated with Stanford, has been supporting these efforts. And some of you may know that we all had a challenging year, and even when we had a lockdown in December, we later had a student say, the steps that you had us regularly practice throughout the year in order to be both mindful and regulate emotions, a student said to their teacher, I used that during the lockdown. That is what we want. We don't ever want to have a lockdown again. But what we want is for students to actively engage in how can I think and monitor and regulate my emotions, because as we've said, they're not bad, but how are we working to do that? And so this is one of our school-wide universal efforts. All students engage in this emotion identification and regulation curriculum through our PE and wellness activities. these lists are way too long for us to go through. But this is just a highlight on all the school-wide practices and the ways that we've been working to embed social-emotional learning and equity, from professional development to sexual assault awareness prevention, and thinking about the fact that we have developed our freshman advisory study hall, and now we have a sophomore advisory study hall to integrate further, as well as our many evening events and school-wide work that students engage in. Our evening programs, as you can see here, many of these actually are driven from community ideas, from parents, from student voices as well. We created many new ones, and that included our Black, Brown, and Breathing to create mindfulness opportunities and safe spaces for students, families, and staff of color. Our open studio art work and the therapy and the collaboration with the School-Based Health Center, Rebel Human, our own ETHS Mindfulness Studio, and our coaches, and the many ways, as I mentioned, the Kick Care packages, and then the home visits. So there's many ways that we've been working, and then this year we were really excited that we continued to engage with our student summits. Our student summits are part of our social consciousness series, and another way that student identity is lifted and that their voices are heard. So do I have another minute for the closing? As we think about what are the many ways that we're trying to support mental health, trying to support well-being, thinking about that from we all own this together. This is not about mental health professionals only at ETHS. This is about each one of us having a role to support students, and each one of us having a role to improve our own social-emotional competencies as well. And that includes for healing and restorative practices, including when I make a misstep and need to look at how am I going to help heal. So I do want to just say thank you, because I think the act of each of us being here creates a culture of care, and it sends the message that we're all committed to doing better now, in the future. And as we think about that, I'd like to share the words of Brené Brown, because together we can do this. And her quote is, "When we have the courage to walk into our own story and own it, we get to write the ending." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kinzie. As I approached the building this morning, I was in awe of the beauty of the building, and had a sense that it was a place of pride and a place of community. And you have definitely shown that through the data you've presented, through the information you've presented, but also tapping into the multidimensional aspects that we need to pay attention to when we're caring for our youth, and having so many approaches to do just that. So thank you. Thank you. All right, we have Emily Hur next. She's going to talk about her lived experiences, talk about intergenerational trauma as well. Emily is a UChicago alum, like myself. We talked about a little bit about that shared experience, and not just kind of the nostalgia that I brought to the conversation, because it was many, many years ago for me, but also about the competitive educational settings that we all have probably been in at some point in our lives, and how our mental health interacts with that setting. Emily is also an author. She's a management consultant. Her book is Everything I Leave Behind for You, available on Amazon. Emily is also a designer of digital content and probably other content as well. And we look forward to hearing from her. Emily, please. Thank you.
All right. Hello. I did not prepare a presentation today, so we'll keep looking at ETHS 2021 graduation behind me. Unfortunately, I was not from ETHS, so apologies. And before I begin, I just want to give a big thank you, not to just our panelists and the people who made this possible, but really just everyone who's here today. As somebody with my own lived experience, I'm very moved to see that there are this many people who've come out and care about adolescent mental health. So thank you all for that. So my name is Emily. Many people know me simply because of a story I tell, and it's a very common story from where I'm from. I'm from the Bay Area of California, and I know a lot of parents from there know me for my accolades, They know me as someone who graduated as our high school valedictorian. They know me as somebody who graduated the University of Chicago early, went on to very prestigious jobs. But at the same time, I think many of you here don't know me, and I think that's even more powerful. And it's because you don't know me that I hope my story and what I share today shows that I am another story, and I might be somebody that you know personally, and I hope that you take something away from it. So I'm not as qualified as our other speakers were here today. I don't have Ph.D.s. I didn't go to school for psychology or anything of the sorts. But I think the reason I'm still standing here today is because I'm another data point among all the statistics. We saw Dr. Singer present many statistics just now, and while I am just one of millions of people who struggled, I'm also one of millions who don't want to just be a statistic, and I hope that my story resonates today. And so once again, many people from my community know me as what I would call a trophy child. You know, high school valedictorian, prestigious awards, prestigious scholarships, you name it. I was the kid that all the other kids hated because their parents were probably comparing them to me at the dinner table. A lot of people, a lot of strangers, watched me as I walked across my high school graduation as a valedictorian, giving our class speech. I knew there were a lot of people who, once again, saw me for these accolades. But at the same time, a lot of people didn't know my story. In fact, I don't think many people knew my story. Many people didn't know that when I was 11, I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety, but that was only after my third suicide attempt at 11. Many people didn't know that when I was 16, I was hospitalized for a suicide attempt as well for an overdose. Many of my peers didn't know that. They just thought Emily took an extended vacation for a few weeks outside of school. Many people didn't know that when I went through college, I was struggling with an eating disorder, threatening me to drop out of college at multiple points. And right now, many people don't know that I'm going through rehab for that eating disorder. And it's a lot of struggle that doesn't get to the surface. I felt very alone growing up. I had no one to talk to. Once again, that is why I'm very moved to see all the people here today who care about adolescent mental health. I felt very alone. I felt a lot of shame as well. I come from a community that did not have any conversations around mental health. You know, mental health really was just like a 2-hour educational video we saw in our 7th grade biology class. That's nothing. And by not having any conversations around mental health and mental wellness, I felt so alone. I thought I was the oddball. I thought I was the one who wasn't normal and was weak and couldn't keep up what all my other peers could do. But now when I look back, I notice that these are effects of generations of trauma, of struggle, and of pressure that have gone too long being unsaid. And that's why I'm here today. I want to talk to you about intergenerational trauma. So what is intergenerational trauma? You know, like any good college student, I do most of my studying off of Google. So the Google definition of intergenerational trauma is known as either trans or multi-generational trauma. It's trauma that gets passed along down those who experience an incident and then pass that trauma onto subsequent generations, simply because they have not known how to cope with it, how to struggle with it, and how to process it. This can happen on individual levels, or this can also happen as a collective community. And just listening to the statistics that Dr. Singer has brought up, listening to the stories that Dr. Kinzie has brought up, we notice intergenerational trauma more and more now as children of our future generations must struggle with intersectionality. We are no longer just a single identity, but instead those made up of multiple. Intergenerational trauma affects us when families don't know how to cope and therefore set a precedent for future generations. It comes down to how emotions are dealt with in the households. Do you come from a household where emotions are hidden, where emotions are instead shown in violent rage? Do you come from a household where parents choose to abuse substances because they don't know how to cope with what they're going through? These all set precedents for children, and like myself, I came from a household that didn't know how to cope with these emotions. I come from a household that learned to shut these down, to act like they didn't exist. And so when I was going through them, I felt like I had no one. And again, many children struggle with these kinds of traumas, and we each struggle with it in our own ways. And the problem of intergenerational trauma is the fact that it is intergenerational. When this trauma is unaddressed and help is never received, it continues to get passed on among future generations to the point where it can no longer be traced back We can never find a source to intergenerational trauma simply because it's been so embedded within us. It might be genetic, but most of it really is just how we live our lives. And personally, again, like any college student, I'm really bad at learning from textbooks, and I tend to learn better from real-world experiences, and that's why I'm here today. I want to share a little bit about my story and my experience. I remember when I was just a shy 19-year-old, learning about therapy and being okay with the idea of therapy. My therapist casually mentioned to me for the very first time about trauma, and it wasn't saying anything like, oh, you struggle from trauma, but rather just casually in a sentence asking me something along the lines of, how do you think your trauma affects you? And I remember stepping back for a moment, genuinely being in shock and saying, oh, I don't struggle from trauma. Like, I don't have trauma. I remember my therapist then stepping back in shock as well. But like, that's just the truth. I believed for the longest time that trauma was a word for people who, quote unquote, go through worse than me. I thought I had a very privileged life, and I admit I did have a privileged life. I had 3 meals a day, I had a roof over my head, and I never needed to wonder where I can go home that night. And so I kept on telling myself, you know, I had it better than a lot of other people did. I had a lot better than my parents did when they immigrated over. Therefore, I don't suffer from trauma. I'm just weak. I just don't know how to cope yet. I just don't know how to struggle. And this form of gaslighting of myself is what kept me in the dark for so long. It's what kept me from therapy. It's what kept me from help. And 3 years later now, at 22, my experience is a result of multiple generations of trauma that have been passed down among my family. It comes from a multiple of cultural experiences, whether that's from the community I came up, whether that's from my ethnic experiences, or whether that's just from the people I interact with now. I am a product of everything around me. My suicide attempts when I was 11, when I was 16, when I was 20, all of these, while they are individual experiences, they are a culmination of the things that I have come from. I grew up in a household that always told me I was weak, that I was a coward, that I was never enough. I come from a household that, when I first told them at 11 that I tried to kill myself, I was shut down and I was told I was a coward that didn't know how to face the world. I had a lot of hatred for my family then, and it's still something I'm going through. But I am now understanding that the way my parents, the way my family reacted is because they didn't have these conversations as children. They didn't have mental health growing up. I am privileged now to have this conversation of mental health with others who are willing to, but my family didn't. And while their response left much hurt in me, it is up to each of us to decide whether or not we pass on that hurt to future generations. And so I come from a history and I come from a household that has forced me to realize that it's been a household that I can't learn to accept love from, and instead I must learn that and accept that from others. I come from a household that finds it difficult to admit care, that finds it difficult to say I love you to each other, and I must find that from other resources. But unlike my previous generations, I'm choosing to find that from others. I'm choosing to look outside of just my generations of what have come before me. And once again, that's a choice that all of us have. It turns out that with therapy and a lot of work, I learned that my parents didn't know how to care for me, and that wasn't their fault. It's never the generations behind us and their faults. They only know what they know. They're doing what they were taught to do. But at the same time, it showed me that it wasn't my fault, and that I couldn't keep blaming myself for what the generations have left me with. And with this continued intensive therapy, even with diagnoses, I still struggled. I still have days when I question myself and I ask if I'm truly as depressed, if I'm truly as anxious as I think I am. But then I recognize that that voice that's questioning me is my intergenerational trauma. Honestly, these self-destructive behaviors come from my culture and where I come from. And I'm sure many of us share cultures and communities that have seen similar messages. And part of me really hates that. It really hates that that's where I come from. And it hates that my culture has left this in me. It's left me with a lot of struggle that I had to grow up with. But at the same time, it's a culture that's made me who I am today. My therapists tend to come from a Western culture. I come from an Eastern culture. My therapist tells me I'm in pain, and that I'm in trauma, and that I'm struggling and I need to heal. My Eastern culture and my family tell me I'm weak, and that I'm a coward, and that I'm going through just a fraction of what they've gone through. And just we're living and growing up in these kinds of conflicting definitions, these kinds of conflicting narratives. It's no wonder that children of this generation that go through intergenerational trauma and intersectionality of identities struggle to learn and struggle to understand what messages they need to hear. And so as time went on, as I continued to grow up, again, I began to see that it wasn't my fault. And even though I may hate it, and even though I may hate what my parents have left in me, I need to understand that it's the truth. And it's something that I must work through to make sure that my future generations don't continue what I've gone through. But at the same time, I also understand now that my parts have shown me things that I didn't see before. I've been asked often if there's anything I would change of my childhood, if there's anything I wish had gone differently. And of course, there's so many things I wish that could have gone differently. But I also, as much as I don't wish my experience on others, I also would not have wished it to be any different. And because it's the struggle I've gone through that has allowed me to stand up here today and be as vocal as I am about advocating for change, advocating for a stop to this intergenerational trauma. I wouldn't wish my experience on others, but I wouldn't wish it any differently either. I'm proud of the cultures I come from. I'm proud of the generations before me, but I also want to be proud of the legacy I can leave behind. And so, obviously, what's on all of our minds, what can we do to help stop and to help prevent intergenerational trauma from moving forward? And again, I'm not a qualified professional. I'm a consultant. I studied art in college. I only speak from my experience. And I do appreciate everything that Dr. Kinzie and Dr. Singer have said up here so far today. Everything and all the tips that they've shared are all tips that I wish I saw growing up. These are all tips I wish my community saw growing up. And even though I might just be one voice in an auditorium today, I hope this helps you take it back and realize that there is a resonance with the words they've had. There is an impact behind it all. And so what can we do to help stop intergenerational trauma? For me, and for all of us really, we need to first start by recognizing now that our experiences are not isolated in this world. We don't live in a vacuum. We are a part of much healing, of much history, and it's not just yourself, but those around you, those you come from. Like Dr. Singer said, it's not completely your fault, but it is all of your experience. Don't blame yourself. Don't continue to burden this alone. Understand what has come before you, where you come from, and understand what you can do moving forward. It may appear isolated, but it's not. We all come from an intimate history that intertwines with our parents, our grandparents, and all the generations before. And at the end of the day, it's no one's fault why we are the way that we are. We are a product of a cruel world, but we can choose whether or not we let that continue. There's no excuses for who I am and who all of us are. But at the same time, because there are no excuses, it means that we are responsible for what we pave forward and who we are becoming. My history and who I come from is simply the start of the story that I want to leave behind. Again, I'm not the only one going through this. I know at least a multiple of people in this auditorium likely have gone through similar as well. And once again, I might just be one of millions who are going through this experience, but like many, I am one of millions who refuse to just be quiet. There's many who experience intergenerational trauma in multiple ways. I've shared how I went through it, but for some others, it might look like indirect communication. It might look like keeping secrets in a family. It might look like silence. It might look like not knowing how to cope with difficult world issues. It might look like not knowing how to go through grief. It might look like submission, fear, a lack of a sense of belonging, and so much more. The truth is, we are all of our histories. And with ourselves, we can stop the intergenerational trauma that we come from as long as we become aware of it and become aware of our own healing. And it's never too late to start. We come from complex generations of multiple cultures, and it's only going to get more complex as we move forward. Multiple identities, multiple types of intersectionalities are now making way. And as a child, I kept on questioning myself, why can't I be normal? There were times when my parents asked me, why can't you be normal like all the other kids? Why can't you go to school and come back and just have a normal day? And I ask myself that often. Like Dr. Singer said, a lot of the messages we get from the external world do become internalized as children. And unfortunately, the expectations my community had of me became internalized with myself. For every child that asks why they can't be normal, I want us to share the message that they are writing the new normal and that there's no longer a normal in this world anymore. and that we can't keep trying to feel like we don't belong, because we do belong. We belong in a world of people who are just trying to belong. Normal comes from multiple identities. The definition of normal now is an intersectionality, and it should be beautiful, but unfortunately, we are still making our way there. And so once again, I have lots of gratitude for the people who are here today who are trying to make this new normal. Intersectionality, multiple generations of culture is beautiful, but we need to recognize that beauty, and we need to start recognizing it within all of us. And so how do we prevent it from continuing if we do see it in other individuals, not just ourselves? First of all, we start with ourselves. Start with admitting, whether you are a child, a parent, a grandparent, that you come from a history of trauma and struggle. Understand where you come from and understand how to stop it. We're not responsible for our past, but we are responsible for our futures, and we need to make sure that we don't continue this way. I'm not responsible for the trauma my family has left me, and I've had multiple difficult conversations with my parents, trying to reach them and trying to share with them the trauma that they've left with me. Unfortunately, I've come to acceptance that my family might just be a family that does not accept this. And even though it's been a difficult truth to accept, this does not mean I'm going to let that continue in my future family. And so start by recognizing your own trauma. Be okay with it. Sit with it and learn how to heal with it. But then, for those of us who I know are parents in this audience, what do we do if we realize that our children are also going through trauma? Dr. Singer has already shared many helpful tips, and I want to echo some of those that he's shared. Start by validating what your children are saying. Growing up, it was very difficult for me to find validation to the point where I was gaslighting myself, and I couldn't believe my own words. Start by validating. Start by listening. Even if you don't understand what your child is going through, that doesn't mean they aren't going through what they are going through. So please sit down and listen. Please don't think it's just a phase, because more often than not, it's because the phrase, "it's just a phase," it's because of this that many children end up taking their own lives. It might be hard, but take a good look at yourself and where you come from. Look at some of the things your parents did that you didn't like, and reflect whether or not you're giving that on to your children as well. It's difficult to face ourselves, but it's what we need to do to make sure we don't continue it with our future generations of adolescents. Reach out and find resources if you find that you cannot be equipped. I've had strangers reach out to me, whether that's by email, by LinkedIn, by Instagram DMs, asking me for help, how to help their children with resources, how to help their children communicate. And it takes a lot to ask for help, especially when as parents, you think you know what's going on, but there's still a lot to learn. And so there's no harm in reaching out and asking for help. Dr. Singer shared that as a parent, we don't want the best for our children, and instead, we want the best for our children and not for our child to be the best. And I want to emphasize this one more time. I know that as parents, you all want the best for your children, but sometimes it's also worth listening to your child to understand what is the best by their definitions. We were all raised in different households and different times in different generations, and things have changed. You might know what was best in your generation, but listen to your child and listen to them, because maybe they have a piece in what's best for them. And it's worth giving them a seat at the table as well. And I want to finish off here that my last suicide ideation was in 2020. There was a time when I was asked to drop out of college because of my eating disorder, and I was going through a lot throughout the pandemic. If you asked me then if I'd be standing up here today, I would not believe it. I was still going through a lot, and I wouldn't believe you if you told me I'd be standing up here today, sharing my story, trying to be vulnerable, and trying to share with individuals to support a future generation. But the world works in strange ways, and here I am today, somehow by a string of connections. I had written a book this last year called Everything I Leave Behind for You. I just published last week, so it was a personal milestone for myself. But the truth is, I pushed off publication for over 6 months because I didn't know how to release my book. It's a book that not only details my story, but a lot of the lessons I've learned, a lot of the hard lessons I've learned around self-awareness, about dealing with trauma. And in my book, I introduced that, like I opened up here, I am just one data point. But even though I am just one data point in a sea of countless data points, that does not mean my story does not matter. And I hope that just by one person starting to be vulnerable and starting to heal, it can start waves to show others that healing is possible. Again, when I was graduating from high school, many people saw me as a valedictorian. They saw me walking down the aisle, and they saw me for my accolades. But today I'm standing up here because I no longer want to perpetuate that story of a trophy child. I no longer want to perpetuate the intergenerational trauma that I've come from. And when I graduated high school, I had a phrase on the back of my graduation cap. It said, "Make it a life worth living." At the time, I didn't know how much this phrase would end up saving me. Because every single day I do look back and I ask myself, have I made it a life worth living? And I want to say thank you to everybody in the audience, the people who've made this possible, and the people who are here today listening. That every step is a step for me to make my life worth living, and I hope that you do as well, not just for yourself, but the future generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. Emily, you, and I could probably speak for many of you in the room, you really exemplify one of the major reasons why we're here today. Thank you for your transparency and your dedication to building voice and advocacy. It's such an important part of mental health for all of us, but particularly for adolescents. All right, I think we're going to move into our Q&A. I do want to remind everyone we do have the Slido QR code in your materials, but you can also write out questions that you may have on index cards. And I believe one of our blue shirt supportive staff members will be able to gather those questions. So if you need to do that, please do so. And I do have Slido here. And actually, I'll give us a minute to kind of shift into a more interactive mode. So if you do have questions you want to jot down, please do so. And please access Slido if you prefer that method. Okay, I am seeing our questions come in. Thank you so much for these submissions. Thank you, Dr. Singer. We have our QR code here as well. Okay, let this stay up for a moment. And then I see our next question here. So I'll advance to that. Okay. Okay. It looks like we have actually a poll question. And the question is, in your opinion, what is the most pressing adolescent mental health related issue? So I'll go ahead and let our audience have a moment to answer that question, and I'd love to get our panelists in terms of their opinions about the most pressing mental health related issue and some of the intervention facets that you want to share with the audience related to that issue. So far, managing depression and anxiety symptoms is our highest rated issue. Looks like that will be our highest rated issue. All right. Dr. Singer, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, so I think that what we know is that depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms have increased over the last couple of years. I also think it's important to say that that's understandable. Right? I mean, if we do the thought experiment and say, let's travel back in time to the beginning of the Great Depression, and we asked folks, how are you doing? They're like, I don't know. I'm feeling hopeless, having a hard time sleeping, I'm anxious about the future. You'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. Because you're in the middle of the Great Depression, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic. A lot of adults didn't know what they were doing. Kids are anxious. So I think that, yes, managing depression and anxiety symptoms is a big deal. And I think that it's an appropriate response for these uncertain times.
So I think I'd like to add on to the yes and, because all of these, it's really hard to say there's one particular. And when we think about first identifying any concerns, one of the tips that I would say that we've engaged in as an entire school community for students, for parents and family members, for community members, and for our staff is really focused on that first identification, and it can rest with depressive symptoms and anxiety, but it can be related to all of these things, which is to practice, acknowledge, care, tell. And obviously both Dr. Singer and Eliher have spoken to this, that importance of, and we ask students to do this with each other, acknowledge the experience when someone is sharing, whether that's about depression, anxiety, potential harm, having been bullied, any of these. Stop and pay attention, even if you're exhausted and you're parenting late at night, even if you're not accustomed to stopping to acknowledge it. We like to fix things. And so we want to stop that by not moving into problem-solving mode, but acknowledging it, showing that we care, and telling the person that, and this counts for our students as well, who often want to be the counselors, and to make sure that they are telling them, I'm going to help you by getting help. I'm going to tell someone so that we can walk through this together. And so we just continue to say thank you to our community, because the number of times that we actually, in terms of most pressing situations, all of these fall within this, and we have a lot of referrals around acknowledge, care, tell that have been acts of prevention. So.
Continuing the trend of yes and here. I mean, I think what I would add on here of what I think is the most pressing adolescent mental health related issue right now really is the stigmatization around mental health, the lack of awareness around it really. As an adolescent, it was very difficult for me to feel like anybody truly cared. And yes, like I had access to all the resources, I knew all the hotlines, but I felt ashamed to reach out. I felt like no one actually cared if I did, because mental health was never a conversation I had. It wasn't really something that anybody took seriously around me. And so I think the continued stigmatization and then the lack of awareness around mental health, the lack of conversations around it make it very difficult for teens to even want to reach out in the first place. And so we can give them all the resources in the world, we can do all the coaching we want, but they have to be the ones to make the first step to ask for help. And we need to be able to show them that it's okay to ask for help. And so to me, just that very first step is still the most pressing issue right now.
Thank you all. I'm going to actually transition to another question that was just submitted on a related note, especially in talking about stigma and transitions into and toward adulthood, specifically around sexual orientation and gender identity. Of course, it's a major factor in terms of human development, developing our sexuality, developing gender identity, but it also can be a very marginalizing one for those that are not supported in their full spectrum of that identity development. What are some of the best practices and factors that you hold as most important in supporting our youth that identify as LGBTQ+? What are those pieces that you want to share with us?
All right, so I have the microphone, so I'll start. That means we'll keep rotating it. So in terms of some of the best practices, we've done a lot of professional development as well as work with all of our students to honor student identity in that intersectional way, right? Whether we're talking about race, culture, gender identity. And so we really continue to ask everyone to pay attention. What are a student's pronouns? How are they using them? How are we honoring their pronouns? It may not fit even within a family's religious structure. And how are we having families and staff members honor students with their identity and the importance of that? We have LGBTQ Plus Summit, which is a student-driven summit where we have workshops and engagement all day long and speakers and keynote speakers. And so these are some of the ways that we continue to lift student voice as well as honor student voice. Some of the additional tips are that we have our own toolkits within a school environment, and there are so many resources online for families as well as for students, whether it's the Trevor Project. There are so many different spaces to utilize that, and we really recommend taking that first step to understand, right? Whether it's your own child, whether it's you're supporting someone else in a practice or in the school environment, seeking to understand first and then identifying what are our next steps. As a school, we have really worked toward what are the other ways that we can support students. So actually this coming Tuesday, we have an evening event. It's a welcome event for incoming freshmen, transfer students, and current students and their families who identify as LGBTQ+. And so that's an evening event where we engage in a very informal way of talking about what are the different resources we provide, whether that's groups, whether that's our all-gender restroom spaces, and what is that, how do students really access that? Continuing that theme that Emily was talking about of how do we want to make sure each student asks for the resources and that we're there to help them each step of the way.
I think for me to answer this, I'm someone who's definitely still learning about the entire spectrum. I'm still learning about all the new definitions that there are. And at the end of the day, I really think that's what matters, that we are open to learning. We are open to asking questions and understanding each other a little bit better. It's really easy to be comfortable in our own worldview of what gender is and what sexuality is. But if anything, if you've been on media for the last 3 years, like, you know that's no longer the case. And so as somebody who's still learning, I found that for my peers, what's been most helpful is just asking questions, and there really are no stupid questions. Sometimes I ask my peers, like, hey, I feel kind of ignorant, sorry I'm asking this so late, but can you clarify like X, Y, and Z? And I know that when somebody asks me that, it actually feels very nice, and it feels like someone is willing to listen. And so right now, once again, just as somebody who is still learning, I think the best I've been able to do for my peers is show that I'm there for them, show that I'm trying to understand who they are, and even if I don't fully understand it, that I'm still there to support them as they're figuring things out for themselves as well. And so for all of us, just sitting down, taking the time to do research, to ask questions, to understand people's experiences and where they come from can really go a long way for sexuality, for gender, but also for much more.
So some of the research has suggested that GSAs, which used to be called gay straight alliances and has been rebranded as genders and sexualities alliances, the schools that have GSAs have lower suicide attempt rates than schools that don't. And there are not so many GSAs in middle schools, but there definitely need to be. And one of the other systemic things that we can do is we can support affirmative curricula in the elementary schools. One of the things that we know about the research in terms of adults who identify as LGBTQ is that oftentimes their first suicide attempt was before they came out. And so if we are waiting until kids come out to us to start to talk about suicide prevention, then we're too late. And so being proactive and preemptive is really important. I think another thing that's important for all adults to remember is that if the only narrative that we are deploying is that queer youth are at increased risk for suicide, then we're writing a narrative that, you know, elementary school queer kids are going to hear and they're going to be like, oh my God, my life is going to be suicide, it's going to be death, it's going to be terrible. And so we can't ignore the beautiful and amazing lives that queer kids can and will have. And so that needs to be part of the narrative so that we are doing life affirmation as well as suicide prevention.
Thank you, Dr. Singer. I think it's so important.
I can hold on to this, there you go.
It's so important to really hone in on those protective factors of our marginalized communities and understand that we're all a part of this community. It's our humanity here. Okay. I am going to actually pull another question from our Q&A. And Dr. Kinzie, I had one for you specifically. Okay. So Dr. Kinzie, how did you support and train the teachers who were supporting the students? I know you spoke a bit about that, but any specifics that you want to talk more about?
Sure. So I think one of the ways that we've worked to do that is to exactly kind of what everyone has spoken to around owning and seeing the humanity in each other. So part of this is thinking about teachers, but thinking about all of our staff. And how are we recognizing the importance of building our own social emotional competencies? I'm trying to build mine every day. And how am I making sure to help others do that as well? So we're really, one of the things we tried to step back a little bit was reflect on, we can say all these words, how are we actually doing it? And that is where some of the steps like the social emotional learning teacher-to-teacher toolkit kind of took hold. We really gave some space during self-directed learning time this year and in professional development opportunities where a group of teachers came together and said, hey, we want to further this even. Let's talk about trauma. Let's talk about the racial components within that and social emotional learning, and are driving that forward. So really giving the opportunity for staff voice organically to identify some of the areas of need. So thinking about the other ways that we want to support staff is we want to think about more of how can we, and this is something we're talking a lot about for next school year, how can we engage more in what we want, what we kind of call behavioral integrity? If we are saying, oh, we need to give grace, but we're not giving grace to the staff we're supporting, if we are saying, you know, we want to support everyone, but we're not taking actions. If we're saying, let's engage in restorative practices, but we're not defining what they are and we're not owning our own mistakes as leaders, then we are not modeling that. Our how and our what have to be congruent. And so that's one of the ways that we're working, in addition to the others, that we're working to make sure to support our staff is by modeling it, that our how does match our what, and that means we're going to make mistakes and that we will own them along the way. I think the other piece that we've really tried to support is practice, consult, consult, consult. It is very different than the real estate location, 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 and yet it's so much more important so that people don't feel alone. And our staff, who, many of whom, whether it's a secretary, our operations staff, our coaches, our teachers, our mental health staff, they walk through so many stories, the journeys that students go through, and they disclose so much. And we have to make sure that they are not carrying that burden alone, and that they also, in knowing what the next steps to support a student, know the right people to come to and can get that consultation and support as well.
I wanted to circle back too to Emily's statement about having those conversations with friends and asking questions, saying, like you said, I'm sorry I'm late to asking this, but, and it reminds me of a social justice tenet about being a constructive irritant. And so having a way to kind of dismantle the stigma through these small conversations that we're having behind the scenes. So maybe not in a group of people that agree with us and a group of people that have our same ideas. How are you showing up in those conversations, and how does that go for you, Emily?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think for me, when I show up to these kinds of conversations, I mean, it already goes without being said, just trying to have an open mind, but also trying to show compassion for others. And right now, I'm working full-time. And one of the things I always tell my teams when I begin working with them, every time I rotate to a new team, I make it very explicit that it's very important to me to get to know everybody as people before I get to know them as coworkers. And I think it's really easy for all of us to approach these kinds of conversations and I think like really separate the humanity from the human, if that makes sense. Like sometimes I even find myself guilty of this, where like I'll hear stories of other people and I'll hear them, but maybe because I don't know them personally, it won't impact me as much. And unfortunately, that's not exactly a great way of going around things, but it's something I'm still working on right now. And so for me, when I come into these conversations, like whether it's with my coworkers or my friends, I really do try to come in and realize that when somebody is sharing a story, when somebody is sharing a vulnerability, all they want to do is to be heard, and the least I can do is offer compassion. And the least I can do is try to get to know them as a person the way they want to be known. So maybe my coworkers want me to know that they're a mom before they want me to know them as my manager. Maybe another one of my friends want me to know that they're going through something, but they don't want that to completely define the way I work with them or the way I hang out with them. And so for me, it's just simply listening to other people's narratives and understanding, asking questions about how they want their narrative to be perceived, always going in, asking first, like, do you want to be listened to right now, or do you want advice? Always asking before I try to help, because again, we might think we know what's best for others, but I think others really know what's best for themselves, and we won't know unless we ask them and give them the opportunity to tell us what they want. And so creating safe spaces, creating spaces of compassion, I found to be very helpful, not just for when I interact with others, but also when others interact with myself.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question for James, actually. Yes. James, how would you recommend introducing spirituality to youth so that they incorporate it into their personal lives?
Can you add one more time?
Sure.
Yeah.
How would you recommend incorporating spirituality to youth, to the lives of youth, so that they can kind of hold that into their spiritual well-being and affect mental well-being?
Yeah. So actually, a lot of this happens, or at least in my experience, in the context of service, of having young people when they do service work. And it could be really tangible things. It could be things that perhaps it's like putting together packages for the homeless through Interfaith Action of Evanston, and they never see the effect, right? But then kind of talking through like why we're doing those things. And again, going back to kind of focusing on, their connection to who they're helping, right? And again, also seeing that person or the people that they're helping as people, right? And not a cause or an issue that needs to just be solved, but kind of through that realm. So we have a lot of conversations that happen after service work, and that kind of open up different avenues for talking about spirituality. Youth also have a lot of questions, and especially this comes up again when I mention things like when youth pull together for funerals and they have difficulty with answers to the question, like especially like our Christian youth, like where is God in all of this, right? Where is God in all the horrible things going on in the world, right? How do we reconcile and how do we be, I guess, in relationship with, right, a being that supposedly being all powerful allows these things to kind of be perpetuated, and also things like a hardened heart, people that are racist or sexist or homophobic. Why does, supposedly a being that's all powerful allow these things to be? And, again, as hard as those conversations are, young people are really actually, looking for answers, right? And it's tough, I think, for us youth ministers because obviously we don't have the answers and never will. As a theologian, I've committed my entire life to never knowing but always exploring God. But I think it's, when we start to talk to them about, spirituality in action and not just as kind of like a high-heady idea, So I don't know if that helps, I'm sorry, I wasn't expecting any questions from me.
You answered beautifully. Thank you. That action orientation is so important to create healthy systems. Okay, I'm actually going to put another poll question up, if you will. I'll give you a moment to answer. I'll read it aloud for us. According to the CDC, which of the following is not the most diagnosed mental health disorder in children ages 3 to 17? Okay, a little bit of a trick question there. That is correct. So depression, ADHD, anxiety, behavioral problems are the most diagnosed mental health disorders in children ages 3 to 17. Excellent job. Okay, I'm actually going to go back to our Q&A. I see a lot of thank yous from the audience toward individual panelists and toward our gathering today in general. So it is clear that this is making an impact. Helping teens struggling with the larger societal issues plaguing our world, such as climate collapse, racial supremacy, homophobia, et cetera. How do we help our teens with these large societal issues? Any suggestions?
Oh, I mean, that's real easy. I'm kidding. I think that one of the things that's amazing about teens is how passionate they are, how dedicated they are, how much they care for each other. And so whatever we can do to support them to feel like, and not just sort of in a performative way, but that they are actually doing something for whatever issue it is that speaks to them, because there's more than enough issues to go around. That's one of the good things that we can do. If we think about the work of developmental psychologist Larry Steinberg, who talks about adolescence as an age of opportunity, providing kids with these challenges that they can then experience and sort of have successful experiences with, develops these neural pathways, develops these ways of experiencing the world that are actually developmentally very healthy. So I think saying, yes, this is a challenge, and so how are you going to meet that challenge? How are you and your peers going to do it? Former Representative Ed Towns used to say, if there's something in my way, I know I'm on my way. And I think that's a really powerful message to send to our kids. So I don't have an answer for any of those issues, but I think that that's a good framework to hold for all of our kids.
I agree, and not that it's easy to solve, but definitely for continuing to look at how are we empowering our students. I think about Freire's focus on a sense of oppression and what we do with that and the critical consciousness that we can continue to build. And our students have a tremendous, and adolescents, a tremendous awareness, and continuing to build exactly on that of, we have awareness, but we don't want to stop ever at awareness because we can get stuck. We as adults can get stuck. And it is that action of what is the next step. That's part of why we intentionally either ask or respond to student voice. So even, for example, we were talking about curriculum and trans-inclusive classrooms and trans-inclusive classroom curriculum. We've invited students to be a part of those planning groups and initiatives. So thinking about our green team, there's the great news in terms of our focus on mental health. Even in the last month and a half, I've met with more than 10 different groups of students who were focused on how can we make it even better to serve mental health needs at ETHS. That's tremendous. And we're responding to that and lifting their voices. It doesn't mean we can do every single idea that is brought forward, but we're listening to it, we're incorporating it into our own fabric, and it gives that sense of what I'm doing makes a difference. And we want adolescents to know that.
Of course, in agreement with everything that's been said here, but I am somebody who likes to start not at step 1, but at step 0. And so for me, when it comes to this question, I think it really just starts at helping teenagers and adolescents process and understand what they're even feeling in the first place. I know there's a lot going on in this world that a lot of us don't completely understand why it's happening. And as teenagers or adolescents who are still figuring out themselves, sometimes we don't always know how we're feeling in response to these. An example for myself is that recently there was a shooting in Orange County, California, in a Taiwanese church, and those are all identities that I come from. I'm from California, I'm Taiwanese, and I'm also identify with the church. And when this news first broke out, I took a leave from work for a day because I just told my team, I don't know how I'm feeling right now, but I know I'm feeling something, and I don't think I am ready to come into work today. And the people around me who were able to sit down with me and help me just process and understand what I was even feeling was a very significant first step for me, because yes, I know I have all these emotions, but what are these emotions? What am I feeling? Maybe it's a bit of fear, maybe it's a bit of anger, but where are those coming from? And sitting down with those hard questions before deciding what actions to take was significantly helpful for me. And so maybe just as people or as adults who have gone through those kinds of feelings, who have gone through those kinds of emotions, it's helpful to support those who are still figuring it out and who are still learning how to process some of the very unfair things that are happening in this world.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to actually go to another question here from our Q&A before we go to another poll question in our last 5 minutes left here. Thinking about some of the loss of the milestones that our teens have experienced, how do we help adolescents come back from the pandemic, knowing that they've possibly lost milestones that are very important in their development?
Oh, geez. This one's interesting for me to answer because I definitely went through graduation in the pandemic. I had a lot of very personal life events happen virtually on Zoom, which was an experience of its own. I think, at least for myself, and what would be helpful for me to come back from those kinds of life events, yes, like we've had a graduation substitution. Yes, like we've redone those events. But I think like the real reason why these milestones really matter to us is because like there's some kind of emotional significance to it, whether it's the connections you've made with people, whether it's celebrating something you've done, whether it's memorializing something. It's that kind of emotional connection that gets lost virtually. And I think that's really what it boils down to when we look at how do we bring these milestones back that we've lost in the pandemic. And so for me, it's like celebrating with friends and with people who I care about, who I know they've had significant milestones that they weren't able to celebrate virtually the same way they would in person. I know that what they miss isn't exactly like the fanfare. It's not like the dinners and everything that they miss. They miss the connection that comes out of these kinds of milestones. And to reconnect, to try to recreate and try to strengthen those relationships despite virtual pandemic getting in our way, I think would be really helpful for just myself and some of my peers who I know who are feeling similarly about some of the milestones that we've had to go through in the pandemic.
Thank you. So I think one of the things at ETHS that we really tried to do was focus on the joy of reconnecting, just like you were saying, whether that's the personal relationship or the events. So our homecoming, while we were still in a pandemic last fall, was held in, for those of you who went to ETHS back in the day, near Pneumonia Alley, now called Senior Courtyard. And it was a tremendous event. And there was a lot of focus and more attendance at homecoming than in our previous years. And we knew that we wanted to make it special. And we know we can't make every single milestone moving forward the most special, but we do want to build that up. And so as we think about a couple of pieces of, as we're moving forward, we know that some of the milestones that we're moving ahead with are going to have different significance, and we can make them special and give them that space. We may not be able to sustain that in that way, and we may not, as Emily said, go back. We may not be able to recoup some of what we have lost. And so that's where the importance, I think, for us of honoring and grieving what we have lost, and what ways do we want to honor those losses. So creating new traditions and new opportunities either to reconnect and emphasizing that importance of who have you not connected with from a friend peer group perspective? Who have you been thinking about even since 4th grade that you haven't seen? And rebuilding some of those relationships, but also what are some of the same ways that we grieve the loss or death of a loved one, and we may not be able to be together in the same way, so what are some of the traditions that we can create on our own, whether that's going to going to a lake and being able to have a quiet moment, or with peers being able to do some things, but creating some structures and some steps that can be taken are ways both that we've done it informally as well as formally.
Wonderful, wonderful. I know at TCS we've had virtual graduations. We kind of turned it into a dance party, DJ included. And so that was a way to still create that special time. And also we've kind of lost these things as a community in a way. And so hopefully our teens can connect to others to talk about how they've kind of adapted to these losses together. Wonderful. Okay, I know we are actually getting close to our transition time. I'm just going to pop another poll question up in case we have a little bit of time left. According to the CDC, what are the indicators of positive mental health present in most children ages 12 to 17? Please select more than one. Hint, hint. I think the key thing here is 12 to 17. Another hint. Okay. The indicators are curiosity, persistence, and self-control for our 12 to 17-year-olds. All right. So before we transition, any parting words that our panelists would like to share? I personally want to thank you all for this, but I want to hand it over to you if you have any parting words.
Again, just a massive thank you to everybody who's making this possible, everybody who's attending as well. Thank you for showing an 11-year-old me that there are people who care and there are people who want to help out in the world. So please keep doing what you're doing. Please keep showing up at these events. Please keep asking questions and talking, because you are making an impact in the world, even if it's just on one life. So thank you for what you're doing.
I think I'd like to say thank you as well, and thank you for the ways that you're attuning to adolescents' needs. And our own act of attunement takes a lot out of us. And I say that as a leader, as a parent of teenagers, as a community member, and as a licensed clinical social worker. The act of attunement it demands a lot of us to really pay attention and be present. And it doesn't mean we get it right every single time, but adolescents know when you're paying attention and that you're showing the care. So thank you for that.
I just want to end by saying that we've talked a lot about adolescence and different parts of adolescence, and I also want to say that all of us come to this work, as was just mentioned, with different hats. And I think that one of the biggest problems with the way that we've approached mental health is we have divided things up. So you're either a professional or you're a consumer. You either are somebody who's living with mental illness or not. And I don't think that those divisions are very helpful. And I think that acknowledging the synthesis is actually going to be one of the things that moves us forward in this conversation. Because the kids who are struggling today are possibly the adults who are going to struggle in 10 years from now. And so this is a lifespan issue. And so the more that we can say, hey, as an adult, I'm struggling with this, and I'm a professional, and I have kids who are this, and blah, blah, like the better it is for all of us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all. All right, I'm going to actually hand it over to Tracy to tell us what is next. Thank you.
I think we're going to skip this next one. Okay, that was fabulous. Thank you so much to Dr. Brooks, Dr. Singer, Dr. Kinzie, Emily. Thank you all so much. It's been fantastic. We are going to break for lunch. Please take the opportunity to visit our exhibit hall if you haven't already. When you exit, we're going to head right and then left towards the north wing. We have lunch pickup set up just past where you registered. Then we have 2 eating spaces. One is room N112, which is a community room. There is a sign there. Volunteers will guide you. We also set up an outside space in the senior courtyard, or Pneumonia Alley. It is a little cooler than we expected. We thought it was going to be in the low 70s today, but for those of you who'd like to eat outside, that opportunity is available. Afternoon breakouts start at 1. We would like to proceed there a few minutes before that so we can maximize the time that we have available to us. The first session starting at 1:15. Anyone who has applied for CEUs, I said I would remind you, must sign in at the registration table, please, for this panel, and then you'll sign in at each individual break-in. There'll be a separate sign-in sheet for that, because you'll get one certificate for the panel and then one for each breakout that you attend. We'll break at 2:30, and the second session will begin at 2:45. Those that stay at the end, until the end, will be able to view a gallery wall. The teen session, they'll be creating posters for us, what they wish we knew. And that'll be how we exit the conference today, is with those very powerful messages. When you leave the conference, whether now you're not able to join us for lunch, or after lunch, or after one or both breakouts, we ask that you complete our post-conference evaluation. This is going to be absolutely essential for us to know what did we get right, what could use a little bit more work, and where did we just not hit the mark at all. There is a QR code in your folder so that you can do that the same way that you interacted with the Slido. And again, I'm just really excited that worked. It was exciting to see the way people were interacting on their phones and asking their questions. And Dr. Brooks, for you to be able to do that in real time was just kind of fun to watch. You'll also receive a link to that evaluation via email. So if you don't really want to do it on your phone, you'd rather do it on a computer, then you can do that. You can also let me know if you'd prefer to have a paper evaluation, and we'll make arrangements for that. We so appreciate you spending your time with us today. We hope you found the information meaningful and relevant, and that you'll join us next year when we focus on the impact of trauma on mental health. We are hoping to be back here at ETHS. I can't guarantee that yet. They're going to let me know. But a huge thank you to ETHS as our host. This is the first year this conference has been held at this location. And again, we'll see face on your evaluations if this is something we want to do again next year. Finally, for our presenters, we are going to gather for a group photo at 1 o'clock in the lobby area by the fireplaces, so that we can try to get a photo of all of our presenters, breakout session presenters that are here. And I think that is everything that I have. So we're going to break, and thank you again. Follow us on social media. I forgot that part. Thank you all, and thanks again to our presenters.